INCA, of course, as a trade association, represents or seeks to represent the sector to government and to the regulator Ofcom, providing input to consultations, promoting issues that are of common interest to the sector, and engaging with government on programs like the Outside In programme, which is going to be coming into existence in the not too distant future. We also work with members on projects of common interest. So for instance, we're working hard at the moment on a project around switching and wholesale for the operators, which is rising up the agenda for many of the independent operators. This topic, this afternoon's topic, I think you're all here because it's one of the main issues that affects network deployment, one of the main barriers to network deployment, and has been the subject of an awful lot of work by both the sector itself, by government, and by others to try to improve the situation when it comes to obtaining rights of way, getting the right sort of Wayleaves to ensure that people can actually build and deploy the networks effectively. So personally, I'm looking forward to a very educational session and a very interesting session. Welcome again. This is our second seminar like this. We're going to be running quite a few more. Big thank you to our sponsors for helping with these sessions. Without our sponsor support, it's really difficult for us to do these sorts of things, certainly at the price. And I'll say, with that, I'll say over to James. Hopefully we're now ready to start.
Malcolm's given a little bit of an introduction to INCA. I think it's probably worth explaining sort of where we've got to in terms of this series of webinars. And I've just noticed that I failed to change the title of the agenda. How embarrassing! This is the barrier busting series on Wayleaves. Now, obviously, the reason we're doing this webinar rather than having almost what you might call a proper live meeting is good old COVID-19, which probably everyone's heard of by now. It is somewhat affecting the way everything's happening. But what I think is important is that next year we need to be able to get back to business. Not quite sure what's going to happen this year, but next year we need to make sure that we are working as fast as possible to deliver the gigabit nation, full fiber. If we're still working to the idea of full fiber everywhere by 2025, we have some catching up to do. One of the things that we were keen to do with INCA in this series is identify, well, okay, where have we got to in barrier busting? DCMS started their barrier busting some time ago. Richard will be able to give us more detail because I can't remember when it was, but it's been in place a few years now. And it's made a lot of good progress, a lot of best practice there, but we're aware that perhaps not everywhere is joining in, and maybe there are still some improvements that we can make. So what we want to do from an INCA member perspective and other stakeholders, identify where have we got to, is there anything left that we can do either in implementing the best practice that's already there, or perhaps in developing best practice even further, so that as far as possible next year we can make as rapid progress as we possibly can in delivering the fibre networks in particular. So, Malcolm, is there anything more that you want to say now that we have, shall we say, sort of formally started?
Not really. Just thank you very much, everybody, for your forbearance. And hopefully we're going to have a very helpful and useful seminar covering the Wayleaves issue, which is something which is, it's one of those issues which is very much at the forefront of many people's minds as they're trying to plan and build new networks. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to learning more.
Okay, Richard, handing over to you. You should be able to unmute and you should be able to share your screen and show any slides from there. Good afternoon, Richard.
Well, thanks, James and Malcolm, for the introduction. I think you'll be able to hear me. I haven't prepared any slides, so you guys have the joy of listening to me talk about public sector assets, Wayleaves, and the code, which, as we all know, is the gift that keeps on giving. So I probably won't hit my 15-minute slot, but I'll just kind of give you an update of where we're at with a couple of different strands of work. And then there's plenty of time later in the webinar for you guys to ask questions. I will say that there was a latest change to the schedule. So my colleague Lisa has been ill recently, not with COVID, I can confirm, but she's our expert on all things Wayleaves and code. So if I can't answer any questions, she definitely can. So anything I can't answer, I'll be sure to get you a response shortly. Anyway, so just a very quick introduction. I know that most of you are very aware of the barrier busting team. James mentioned, of course, that we've been around for a few years now. We were set up in October 2017 by the then Digital Minister, Matt Hancock. 3 years is a long time in politics, obviously. And we are now essentially kind of at the stage where we're bringing into realization a number of reforms that we've been working on for the past few years. As Malcolm said, kind of immediately on our to-do list was the question of Wayleaves, which, as you guys are all aware, it's a highly complex area, and it's something that, whilst we're able to make change in certain areas, it all fundamentally comes down to Article 1, Section 1 of the European Code of Human Rights and the right to peaceful property and private property, things like that. Anyway, I'll stop yapping on and get into a little bit more detail around what we've been doing. So I'm going to start off with the bill that we have going through Parliament. Early on in our engagement with industry, it was highlighted to us that one of the major problems with deployment was absentee landlords. So if you're looking to deploy to, say, a block of flats, also known as an MDU, and the landlord does not respond to you, that essentially prevented the deployment of broadband to all the tenants within that block. So we've developed the Telecoms Infrastructure Leasehold Property Bill, which is currently going through processes within the House of Lords. It's on its committee stage, which will be happening next Tuesday via Zoom. So fingers crossed that everything works then. But it will be broadcasted on the Parliament website as usual. So if you want to take a look at what's going on there, you can do so. Now, what the Telecoms Infrastructure Bill essentially does is that where, say, an operator looks to contact a landlord and there is no reply after repeated attempts, and where a request for connection has been made by a tenant, we are inserting a new part into the Electronic Communications Code whereby that operator is granted interim access rights to deploy to that property. So essentially the stage is a tenant makes a connection request, operator tries to contact the landlord several times. If the landlord still doesn't respond, there's a process by which you can go through a tribunal. The operator can lay out the evidence that they've tried to contact the landlord, and including the fact that the landlord hasn't responded, and then the interim access rights will be granted. So that's where we're at the moment. And I'll kind of move on from that. I think a lot of people are aware of this, so I won't kind of dwell on that too much. Major topic, which I think most people will be thinking about when it comes to Wayleaves, is the Electronic Communications Code. Some of what I'm about to say you guys already know, but some of this will be an update. So kind of going back to the beginning, as most of you, as all of you will know, extensive reforms were made to the code back in 2017, and these were intended to make it cheaper and easier for operators to install, maintain, and upgrade their infrastructure. But obviously, since these reforms were introduced, there have been difficulties with different views across the sector as to how this applies to negotiations, particularly contention over the valuation methodology. So we've been working closely on that. I know that there have been a series of tribunal determinations. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors published some guidance late last year in November, setting out how agents should conduct themselves during code negotiations. And first of all, we're very grateful for this. And this also kind of gives an avenue for industry to raise concerns, or indeed to formally complain if RICS accredited agents aren't complying with the standards set out by RICS. But we are, we're not kind of resting on our laurels. We are developing more guidance for all public sector bodies, specifically on valuation, and also kind of giving them an update of recent tribunal determinations. Obviously, we're well aware that local authorities have quite a lot on their plate and don't always have a code expert in-house. So we're looking to kind of assist them where we can. But whilst we have a degree of influence over public sector landlords and authorities, there is kind of limited scope of what we can do in the private sector space beyond what we're looking to address with the telecoms infrastructure bill I've just mentioned. But as mentioned, we're still trying to make progress on this. The Minister for Digital Infrastructure, Matt Warman, is intending on meeting with members of the site provider community and their reps in the near future to kind of bring this back up to the top of the agenda and assess what more we can do moving forward. But I think the biggest thing we can say is that from a policy side, we are reviewing the 2017 code reforms. We're looking at whether further intervention is needed to deliver the kind of aims of the reforms in the first place, which is, as I mentioned, cheaper and easy access for operators to install, maintain, and upgrade their infrastructure. We've been engaged quite closely with industry. We will continue to engage with industry, and we really welcome your input on this. So I've kind of rattled very quickly through the code there, but I'm sure there'll be questions. But just to touch upon something I mentioned, which is our work on public sector land and assets. So this is another big strand of work, I should say, within the barrier busting team, whereby we're extremely keen for both central government sites and kind of local government sites to host mobile infrastructure. If we're talking the talk, we should be able to walk the walk as well. Obviously, this has been a slow process, but progress is being made. We're working carefully with the Cabinet Office at a central government level to kind of educate departments around the code and around what that means in terms of rent and agreements. But as I mentioned, we are also developing guidance for local authorities and other kind of local public sector bodies which hold a number of attractive properties for industry to deploy on. So, I mean, I'll stop there. I don't want to yap on too much. More than happy to go into detail on any of the things we've mentioned. And I should state that similar to the rest of our lines of work in street works or new builds, we also take a look at specific areas where we may be able to intervene directly. So as I mentioned, this is where we can use our influence on public sector sites. So for example, if there's a particular local authority or highways authority that is preventing deployment and initial attempts to work with them have failed, then we're more than happy to take a look at the evidence and step in if there's a role for us to play. Anyway, I will stop there and I will happy to answer any questions or wait for the Q&A session if there's one later on.
Richard, thank you. Before we move on, I have seen that there is just one question here. They're starting to come in thick and fast now. Maybe I'm going to regret this. But from Caitlin Johnson, has there been any development in looking at broadening the landlord bill to include commercial properties?
Great question. So we were quite keen to do this in the first place. However, the evidence that we were given by industry and by all relevant parties, essentially there wasn't enough of it in order to do that. That being said, there are mechanisms within the bill that allow us to add places like business parks to the scope of the bill, provided that we get evidence. So essentially, if you want this done, send us data and we are really keen to get it done.
Okay. Question from Tim. Tim, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. That might save.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, Richard. Good to have you on the session. I think I'm matching a question that Aidan Poole also was asking, which is, should we look to trying to place a sort of a standard Wayleaf agreement within the primary legislation to avoid all the delays and the discussions and the renegotiations that solicitors and landlords seem to want to do at the moment.
Tim, it's Lisa Price from DCMS speaking. I'll pick up that question if that's okay, because this is something I've been looking into at the moment.
Absolutely.
The reason we didn't include a standard agreement in primary legislation when we took the reforms through was because of the difficulty finding something that one size fits all just wasn't feasible, given the variance in different types of installations, different types of sites, etc., etc. What we are doing at the moment, I don't know if you've seen, but on the guidance that's in the public domain, there are links to a number of different templates, including one that we use for central government property, and including the one that's recently been distributed by the GLA. And at the moment, we're doing some analysis to compare that, and also to compare the different template agreements that have been developed by different organisations to say, actually, is there something that we can draw from this that we can make more readily available as a recommended agreement. Now, whether or not we would bring that into primary legislation would be something that we'd have to look at in the course of consultation and in the course of assessing the pros and cons to it. But we are generally in that space looking at, is there something we can do to promote a single framework document, even if that means that we end up doing it for certain types of circumstances, so for urban, for rural, rooftop, etc. Does that help?
Yeah, Lisa, that's really useful. I do understand the complexity, especially when we start looking at mobiles and rooftops as well as fixed line and everything else. That trying to come up with a form of word that fits all scenarios is always difficult. But as you say, perhaps it's a set of 3 or 4 Wayleaves for 3 or 4 different use cases.
Yeah, precisely, and it is something we are certainly looking into, Tim. I think the problem with mandating it through legislation would be it would lead to a certain amount of inflexibility, which could cause more problems than it solves. But we are looking at, well, what can we do to make things clearer in that space? Okay,
I'm going to stop questions there for the moment, or we'll have nothing to discuss later. Actually, that's probably not true, but let's keep all the questions until toward the end, where we can have perhaps a discussion informed by the rest of the presentations. So next we have got Charles Trotman from CLA, who have obviously been doing a lot of work to look at Wayleaves, particularly in rural environments. So over to you, Charles. You should be able to share your screen and show a presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Charles Trotman. I'm CLA's Chief Economist. I'm also responsible for telecoms policy in a rural sense for the Country Land and Business Association. I've been at the CLA for over 18 years now, and we were instrumental back in 2002 with the, in a sense, the national rural policy with regard to telecommunications. And obviously since that time we've moved on significantly. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a brief highlight, in a sense, of the way we view Wayleaves, the importance of Wayleaves in a rural context, what we've managed to do both with other rural organisations, but also the main infrastructure providers as well in relation to rolling out rural Wayleaves for telecoms, and also look at some of the difficulties that we've experienced and we're continuing to experience. And there will be messages in the presentation where obviously there will be people will want to ask questions, but what we're trying to also do through this is actually give a little bit more direction and guidance as to how we think we're going to take this forward in the future. Right, so if we go to the first slide, it's clear that if there's going to be suitable telecommunications in a rural area, there has to be a respect of property rights. But we've also got to get the balance right between the interests and property rights of the landowner and the public interest. And the public interest is a key facet of the code, and it's getting that balance right. And what we've seen over the last 9-10 weeks during the COVID-19 outbreak is the importance of digital connectivity. It's the importance, particularly in rural areas and for rural communities, not just rural businesses, the importance of digital connectivity, the ability to actually be able to work from home, but also connect to other members of the family who may not be in the household, and to your friends as well. That is crucial, because what it's done is it's highlighted not just the importance of digital connectivity, but its usefulness and how it can be exploited in the future. But if we are going to get to a situation where we want to meet the government's objective of, let's call it full fibre by 2025, the balance has to be fair, it has to be right, and it has to be done in collaboration and in full consultation with the industry and in discussions with government. Now, obviously what we want to see, and we've fully agree with the government on this, is the rapid deployment of full fibre technologies. Looking at Wayleaves themselves, to give you a little bit of background, a bit of context, first Wayleave agreement that was negotiated with BT as it was then was back in 2003. It was revised in 2007. In 2012, we came up with the need to have a Wayleave agreement for what we call alternative network infrastructure providers, companies such as Virgin, companies such as GigaClear, and other alternative network providers. And what we've done is there are two agreements, one for Openreach as the main infrastructure provider, and then a separate agreement for alternative network providers. Those two categories are important because as I go on in the presentation, you'll see that we may want to extend that to a third category. And what we're trying to do, again, coming back to this issue of balance, is the need to meet both the needs, not just of landowners, but needs of providers as well. Because if we're able to do that, we'll actually meet the objective of 2025 in terms of fixed line broadband. So what we've managed to do, obviously we had to take into account the revisions to the code back in 2017. That meant we had to begin a kind of renegotiation, a complete review of the Wayleave framework we have for rural areas, which remember, it's not just the CLA, it's the National Farmers Union as well, which is party to this, along with the infrastructure providers. And the idea is to create, by bringing the two agreements together, a set of key principles which take into account the code. We began this, it came into force on the 1st of October 2018, and it's a three-year process, and it will be reviewed in 2021. But that obviously is subject to what we're going through at the moment and timescales, because obviously the 2025 deadline that the government imposed before COVID-19 may slip a little. So what does the framework actually mean? Well, one of the key principles is a consistent approach where compromise between the infrastructure provider and the landowner is absolutely essential. What we've set out here are uniform rates for providers, but these are not mandatory, they're advisory rates. So we know that in a negotiation between a provider and a landowner, there will be obviously an element of negotiation, and it's very possible that through that negotiation, depending on the needs of the community, depending on the needs of the landowners and providers, it's possible for that rate that we've set within the national framework to go down, to actually be decreased based on negotiation. But the reason, one of the big reasons, one of the key principles why we have a framework is to ensure simplicity for both landowners and providers. To give you an example, we heard back from Openreach when we were negotiating this, what they wanted to see was one framework, one document, one uniform, consistent document, so that they could use that in their negotiations with landowners. What they did not want, and we know the alternative network providers do not want, are individual negotiations based on based on completely different sets of principles. And that's one of the key elements of the framework. It is the consistent and uniform approach that it takes. Within the code, of course, we have this issue of valuation. And it's important to stress that within the code, there are two main aspects. One is consideration within a contract for the conferral of rights from a landowner or a site provider to a telecoms code operator. And that is the general valuation itself. The compensation, however, is for if there's adverse visual impact or if something goes wrong when the deployment takes place. And that's an individual compensation, which the framework deals with, but it deals with in a very, very general way. And I'll look at that a little bit later on. We turn to a few other elements. As I said, the framework or the code itself establishes the conferral of rights. It creates a balance. What we have said right from the beginning, ever since the revisions to the code were thought of by government and consulted upon by the industry and by the Law Commission, was we do not want to see ransom rents. We do not believe that landowners should be holding anybody, whether they be Openreach or an alternative network infrastructure provider, to ransom, because that defeats the whole object of faster and more effective deployment. And we recognize that there has to be willing buyers, there has to be willing sellers. It's important to remember that we're talking here about fixed line deployment, not mobile. We'll talk about mobile a little later. Sector is extremely difficult in which to negotiate a sensible market price. And that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks we've got at the moment with the mobile market and mobile infrastructure providers. And as I said before, we have two agreements, and these tend to relate to the bigger players in the market. Now, what we want to do is we want to look at the idea of having a third agreement in place for the smaller alternative network infrastructure provider, which I'll give a few more details on in a couple of slides' time. One of the big problems that we've got at the moment are issues of engagement. What we're finding is that although there is a code of practice from Ofcom in place, it is rarely being either looked at or relied upon, which is a problem. We also know that Ofcom is certainly not minded at the present time to revise or amend that code of practice. What was slightly unfortunate is the code of practice was drafted by the industry itself, so it's necessary for the industry to revise and review the code. What we've found is that because there's been this breakdown in communication, because the processes in negotiating Wayleaves and within the whole process of deployment is not working as it should be, it's taking far too long to deploy. So what we were negotiating before COVID-19 came along is trying to establish a clearer set of arrangements, what we call a protocol, which is a step-by-step approach. We know there are two big problems here. One is the lines of communication between the provider and the landowner. But the other key issue is the lack of understanding that landowners have as to how Wayleaves can be used and need to be used. And as I was talking earlier about the needs of providers and the essential objective, which we all share, which is the far faster rollout of fiber technology and full fiber, and trying to meet that government target of 2025. So what we want to do is put in a process which is far more informative, both in terms of the provider, so they understand the needs of the landowners, but also essentially for the landowners themselves, so they understand why they're being asked to provide a Wayleave and why they're being asked to confer certain particular rights under the code. Now, in terms of mobile connectivity, as I said, fixed line and mobile are uniquely different, and the situation within the mobile sector, frankly, is a mess. We've had 2.5 years of trying to negotiate arrangements with the mobile operators or the mobile infrastructure providers in terms of valuation, and we're still negotiating and we're still not getting anywhere. However, the governments and the industries and the mobile industries concept of a shared rural network should actually resolve many of the valuation issues that we've come up against. But again, in order to actually make sure that the shared rural network is implemented properly, there has to be compromise, there has to be flexibility on both sides. As said, I've said to many people, many of which are on this webinar, I'm more than happy to sit down and start talking. But it has to be a shared process. And this comes onto a third point, and this comes onto the potential for a third agreement. Now, it's very possible, during the review of the Wayleaves agreements that we have at the moment, which we have to conduct next year, it's very possible that we could begin, and we're more than happy to explore the idea of trying to negotiate a third agreement for smaller alternative network providers. Now, if we were to start that, we need to negotiate with a representative group of smaller alternative network providers. Secondly, we need to look at how that would all fit together within the code, what the appropriate rates would be, and all that will be up for a discussion. And it's by doing that that we're trying to introduce as much flexibility and as much agility within the system, so that the CLA's position, which is fundamentally universal coverage for all rural areas across the country, can be met, and that by the industry and the landowning community, working together to meet the government's objective by 2025. And once we've finally got there, and again, COVID-19 is a classic example of how this works so well, is to be able for rural areas, whether they be communities or businesses, to actually exploit the huge advantages and capabilities that digital technology can offer. And that should end the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Do we have any questions for Charles?
What about PIA? That's from Aidan Paul. As I've got access to the chat button. Aidan, what we're doing at the moment, obviously we have to review the Wayleaves agreement. That's fine, got no problem with that. We're also beginning discussions with alternative network providers. We've started discussions with GigaClear on PIA and how that will work. We understand, obviously, that there are issues which have been raised by DCMS as to the legality of how Wayleaves would work with third parties. Now, in our discussions with GigaClear, as I said, we want to be as flexible, we want to be as agile as possible, and we want to make it as easy as possible for infrastructure providers to be able to use the principle of PIA. And what we've said to GigaClear, and effectively I'll say to all of you, is that we would not put roadblocks or put blocks in your way to come to a sensible, logical solution, as long as we can get that information and that message across to the landowners, because we know for a fact that landowners will not understand what PIA is. And this is where it comes back to this whole issue of engagement. We've got to get the process right to begin with, and then put in place the PIA, a new set of PIA, well, a set of PIA arrangements, which will hopefully meet the needs of all alternative network providers. So Aidan, yes, we are talking, and we were talking before COVID-19. Hopefully we'll start talking again after COVID-19, and come to a sensible arrangement within a sensible and logical process.
Can I just ask, Charles, it's Malcolm Corbett here. I wasn't aware of that, but I think it would be quite helpful, given that quite a lot of INCA members are building networks in rural areas, if we could have a discussion about how that might look and what we can do to assist in terms of promulgating the work on Wayleaves around PIA, because it is a very knotty area, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, no, I've got no problem with that at all. Again, we're talking about timescales here, but as I said, as soon as we can get COVID out of the way, then we want to start negotiations on a number of areas as soon as practically possible. So, Malcolm, yes, thank you very much. More than happy to have anybody who wants to have a discussion, and then we can hopefully get to a viable solution.
Thank you very much.
We've now got some delivery perspectives of 3 organisations who've actually been delivering fibre infrastructure in particular, and dealing with the issue of Wayleaves from that perspective. So I think that's going to give us another view. Let me move this. Hector, are you there?
So I think from my name's Hector Gibson-Fleming. I'm the Managing Director of Wessex Internet, and we're a rural full fibre operator working predominantly in the southwest, so Dorset, Wiltshire, Somerset and Hampshire. We've got more than 1,400 kilometres of fibre in the ground. We've largely built that using soft dig methods across farmland, and so we've got a lot of experience in negotiating with landowners. We actually originated as a diversification project 10 years ago out of a landowning and farming business. So that gives us a pretty good viewpoint or perspective of both sides of the Wayleaves discussion. And for us, it's it's really important that we can see the progress as specifically as we grow that we need to make as a telecoms business, and the industry generally needs to make in terms of building a completely new full fibre network for the country, and particularly for rural areas over the next 5 years, is balanced with the rights of landowners to private ownership of their land. And so from our point of view, our current policy has very much been to work with landowners and work with landowning bodies where we can roll out transformational full fibre in rural areas. And so particularly in the areas that we're expanding to are very often considered completely uncommercially viable for operators. We are quite often going to hamlets of 5 or 6 houses or villages of 20 to 30 houses in very remote areas where we're upgrading people from 1 megasecond to gigabit connectivity. And so the value to not only to the local communities there, but also to very often to the landowners that we're building to in upgrading their buildings and upgrading their tenants is completely transformational. And that's allowed us to work very much with landowners and with the majority of people that across our coverage area. And we would have worked with 300 or 400 landowners over the last 10 years to deliver the infrastructure that we built to date, and are now using trenchless technology to build in the region of 50 kilometers of fibre a month. And we believe in trenchless buried infrastructure that creates minimal disturbance and leaves no long-term visual impact on the land. We collaborate with communities and landowners to keep those costs to a minimum. And the reason we can build in a lot of areas where others struggle, we believe, is because we engage well with the communities and the landowners. And so generally, we will not pay for access we will not pay for access at the moment because we believe that the benefit to those rural communities is in being able to get the connectivity there, and that generally across our area that has been accepted as a fair deal, and in return for that we understand that the landowner needs something out of it. So in that case, we will not charge landowners in excess of the RGC grants that are eligible in those areas. So we will absorb the costs of connecting them in addition to that. And we believe in an agreement that doesn't create future liabilities for landowners. So we have an unlimited lift and shift clause, which means if someone decides that they want to build a building or a development on top of our fibre, we will come back and move it. Because we believe that, you know, for landowners, that's probably one of the biggest worries for them, is all the things that we need to consider that we might want to do here or there, that we've then got someone who says, I'm sorry, but this is our infrastructure now and you can't move it, is a, you know, a big concern for people. And that might be something that major operators can't take into account, but as a smaller operator, we feel that's a liability that we're happy to take on board. And actually, in the entire history of our network, I think we've only had one lift and shift clause actually enacted. We also will have a damage waiver clause for anything but negligent or deliberate damage to the infrastructure. And those we've seen, and certainly ourselves as landowners on the other side of the coin, understand that that's, you know, one of the biggest concerns is around those 2 points in the future liability you're creating by giving a Wayleave away. But however, it is in the way that we build at the moment, and you know, the demand-led approach that we build with at the moment, it's landowners' right to decide that they don't want to sell on their land, and if they refuse access, we will just work around them. But if they want a connection, we will no longer subsidise the cost of getting back to them at a later date, and that's something that, you know, we're very clear about. We're working in collaboration with people, and that's fantastic. And as we grow, we very much intend on keeping that collaborative approach. And making sure that the builds we do are, at the end of the day, supported by the communities that we're going to, because that's why we're here in the first place and why we started the business. However, that said, there are still issues that we see around landowner, around the Wayleave policy and around access negotiations, and it is almost certainly one of the most challenging parts of our business. So our you know, clear and open policy has worked with hundreds of landowners, but we're still beholden to a minority of people who delay negotiations deliberately and say yes to begin with, or change their mind at the last minute, or make negotiations very complicated. And as we scale, that really has a huge impact on the predictability of deployment. And so in rural areas, you know, where, you know, the cost of going down the road is you know, vastly increases the deployment costs, it's often not an option. It's just not, you know, the rollout would just not be feasible for that community if you had to use hard dig. And so we do require the land access of soft dig to be able to deliver for communities. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, as the industry grows and we start saying, well, look, we're trying to roll out to every single property in a parish when we enter the parish, rather than just doing people who take up the service, we need the predictability and be able to get at the access. And, you know, often we see landowners agents who hark back to the last agreed CLA NFU rate, which Charles mentioned earlier, of $3.95 a metre, as the minimum payment to open discussions. And there are so many deployments that we work with where that rate would make it completely uncommercial. And, you know, a lot of the times we are looking at deployments where we're talking about an order of, you know, 500 to 750 metres of fibre built per customer connected, and, you know, that just is never going to stack up if we're talking about paying the rate to get there. Now, as we head towards, you know, F20 and the outside in project, winning bidders are going to have obligations to deliver full coverage. And if we don't come to a compromise here, where there's an understanding on what we believe is a fair rate of compensation towards landowners for building in very rural areas, we think, you know, this is used by a minority of landowners, and it is very much a minority. 9/10 of landowners really get the bigger picture, get the benefit to the whole community, and often they're some of the biggest beneficiaries. But there's a small number of landowners who see their right of land ownership as a reason to be able to sit there and leverage as much money as they can out of a deal. And it's not just the smaller ones; it's some of the national and state operators, state landowners, and I expect a lot of people on the calls will have had serious experiences in areas. But, you know, we need landowners we need a deal where we can see that landowners are all acting reasonably and understand that this is like other state infrastructure, whether that be water or power, where, you know, we need to balance the right to private land ownership in the UK, which is, you know, enormously, you know, it's an enormously free and unimpinged right in the UK compared to a lot of other countries, even in Europe. That right needs to be balanced with the right of people across the country to have access to infrastructure. And I think that in the long term, if landowners are seen to be supporting that, it will benefit themselves as a group, and for us as landowners, we feel that benefits the landowning community as a whole in being seen to enable digital infrastructure. So for us, in terms of the things that we see struggle, actually amazing, in terms of what Charles was saying from very much the CLA side of the coin here, is that are many things that really cross over. Operators need access to access at a reasonable cost and on predictable timescales, and the agreements must ensure consistency to avoid lengthy negotiations and excessive legal costs. And these are around making sure the agreements and the code of practice are in place to have very similar agreements that are fairly well set in stone, but also ensuring in rural areas that we really look at what is the cost that should be in place for that access. In return, we believe that operators must adhere to a better code of practice, and I think I echo Charles's comments that we as an industry need to come up with a code of practice that makes sure that we are seen to operate with landowners in a way that is also fair to landowners and respects their rights and respects their ownership. And that's very important. And for us, certainly, just on a personal company point, it's really important to us that we work constructively with landowners. We don't ever want to be seen in a position where we're working against landowners to achieve our aims. And certainly that respecting communities and local communities and landowners. The countryside is a small place and everyone knows everyone, and so I don't think it does anyone any favors if the industry doesn't act responsibly there. And so the key for us is the reasonable cost of rollout, and we think the 395 a meter is prohibitive for a lot of rollouts, and so I would welcome to take up Charles in entering discussions with anyone else who has a similar line on this, where we think that we need to look at the rate that was agreed 2003, 2010, 2000 in particular, looked at the value to the landowner that was, or the cost to landowner of giving the access, but it also, before the 2017 code update, Schedule 3A Part 4 Para 24 references that no longer can the landowner look to the value to the telecoms operator for that infrastructure. That is the same clause that the mobile operators are using in their negotiations. Now, I completely agree with Charles that this is a different industry and a different discussion, or a different side of the industry, a different discussion. We don't want to go down that route. But I think it is important that if you look at some of the cases that were referenced in the CLA's 2018 note from back in 2002, there's a case with one of the cable companies that said that in the case of a small rollout, the operator in that case, it was reasonable that they paid 70p a meter rather than £3.70 or so that it was then, because it was only going to a few customers. And so surely that would mean that 70p was more like the rate that was the value to the landowner of giving that access, because in that case there was very little value being given to the telecoms operator. And so we think that the discussion is probably going to end up somewhere between the 60 or 70p and the £3.80, but that's the kind of discussion that we need to have on rates to encourage and enable rollout in an area where, for the urban discussion in urban areas, we might be passing houses at £200 or £300 a property, and in rural areas it's sort of more like 10 times that. And so I think that is best achieved with a negotiation with the CLA and a discussion, open discussion, and we very much welcome that. So I can't actually see at the moment the comments, but. So from Aidan, I think the soft dig cost per kilometre, it's very difficult to give a fixed fee on that. It varies massively. The cost of delivering into a picture like that, where you're going across wide open fields, is very different to the cost per kilometre of soft dig in a built up area. So that's definitely not a question I can answer directly there, Aidan.
Okay, Hector, thank you very much. What we'll do is we will continue with the other presentations, and then we'll have a combined Q&A at the end. So next we've got a more urban perspective from Stuart Smith at Zayo. Stuart, are you up? There you are.
Good afternoon. Hi, so yeah, good to see everybody today. Stuart Smith from Zayo. So I've been in the industry about 20 years, so I've worked for a number of different fibre providers and vendors. So I spent a lot of time at Alcatel-Lucent, spent some time at City Fibre, and also worked for a number of local authorities. Most recently actually was Bracknell Forest Council, where we were building a new town centre. So yeah, I've seen Wayleaves from the other side of the perspective, and it can be a big challenge in terms of the barrier busting and Wayleaves. So I've been with Zayo for 3 months. I'll give a bit of background on Zayo. Zayo is an American company born out of Boulder, Colorado. So I've been learning a few Americanisms. I did look a bit silly when everything in Zayo world starts with a Z. So when I turned up, they have these things called Z chats. When I turned to my first one, I said, "Oh, I'm very looking forward to this first Z chat," in a very English accent. It made myself look very silly. So yeah, first of all, wanted to thank Hector. That was a really interesting presentation on the rural perspective, and also thanks to Richard and Lisa earlier on for the update on DCMS, and Charles from the CLA. And I think the particular thing that I took from Charles's presentation was around collaboration, and also Hector's around engagement. So I'll try and touch on that. And also big thanks to Malcolm and INCA and their great work, particularly with what's happening with COVID at the moment. So, okay, so I'm going to dive straight into it. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. I'm getting a nod from James, so that's fantastic. Yeah, also wanted to pass on thanks to Hellman Titan for sponsoring the break there. I very much enjoyed my coffee and a rather lovely apple, so that was really appreciate that support. So what I'm going to cover today, a little bit of an introduction to Zayo, to those of you that don't know us. Talk about some of the challenges within the historical delivery models and how the new technologies are creating challenges, particularly for Wayleaves and barrier busting, some potential solutions and considerations, and then a summary and perhaps some discussion points and call to actions and some final thoughts, which hopefully we can pick up on in the discussion a bit later on. Also, I've got my colleague Jonathan Bremner, who's on the webinar as well. So he and I work together in the government team at Zayo, so working with local authorities, alternative network providers, stakeholders to take the strategy forward. So who are Zayo, first of all? So essentially formed in 2007 with a very simple mission, which was to link up stranded assets across the United States. So link them up and build what is now a global network. So millions of fiber miles and hundreds of thousands of route miles linking up data centers. So a huge amount of investment made in that time. And also we were recently taken private by Digital Colony and EQT Partners, who, if you don't know them, they are big investors in things like mobile cell providers, neutral host 5G providers, Wi-Fi, and obviously fiber. So that puts us part of a very big family that really is now looking at the UK in terms of investing in infrastructure to achieve the 2025 target. The other interesting thing is that in that time we've made 46 acquisitions, and so we've had to take a lot of different data, different mapping in different formats, and standardize that and bring that into a standard format, which we actually now publish on our website. So, and I think that's one of the big parts around barrier busting in Wayleaves is actually standardizing on the GIS mapping. And so I'll touch on that a little bit later. So in the UK and Ireland, we've got around 5 kilometres of fibre miles. So we've got a national network which spans the length and breadth of the country. Recently added 500 miles. I'm going to resist the temptation to sing the Proclaimers. You'll be glad to hear on that one. So, and the key focus for us really is on the sort of peering, cloud and internet peering. In fact, we had about a terabit of peering added per quarter at the moment. And, you know, particularly with what's happening with COVID, we've seen a huge increase in the sort of bandwidth that people are consuming. So very much in the core of the national and international network, we've been doing a lot of work with the likes of Aquacoms and others in terms of bringing those new subsea cables into the UK and connecting that up. Big part of what we do is multi-terabit wavelengths, length and breadth of the country, supporting alternative network providers in their backhaul services. And we've got a national dark fibre and in many places metro fibre, and obviously we're looking to extend that. One of the things we don't do is we're not a retail and consumer fibre to the premise, fibre to the home provider. What we do is we're an infrastructure provider, and the aim is that the alternative network providers that are pushing this new agenda forward are able to utilize infrastructure providers such as ourselves and do all the innovation and competition and progress in terms of the service modeling. But we do all the boring necessary stuff in the ground that you know, makes all the magic happen within the delivery model. So some of the challenges around the market, and obviously you know, INCA members will be able to articulate this perhaps better than me, but you know, we started off very much with a sort of incumbent type scenario, delivering services into people's homes. We then moved to a local loop unbundling, whereby the exchange and elements were opened up so that people could put their equipment into exchanges and provide some competition within the consumer market. We then moved to the fibre to the cabinet type scenario, which actually almost took us, whilst it brought great strides in terms of the speeds that people could use, actually it meant that we were moving more into the cabinet, moving further away from the exchange. And so, but of course, one of the benefits in using the existing infrastructure with fibre to the cabinet and LLU is there's existing infrastructure going into people's homes. So really, there's limited build and limited requirements for Wayleaves if you can utilise that existing infrastructure. Now, one of the great advantages, as we all know, of gigabit capable is, and the agenda that the government is taking, is that means shiny new gigabit capable, shiny new fibre optic, which is fantastic. But of course, one of the challenges of that is, and in certain delivery models, is it's almost, in some instances, you're creating this scenario where a fibre to the premise provider will come along, build an infrastructure, and then potentially we'll have a scenario where another provider might come along and overbuild, again requiring a Wayleave and requiring some construction, and they might actually have a scenario where another provider has then got an exclusivity. So you have a retail provider that has an exclusivity that's working with the wholesale provider, and then, you know, to get further consumer choice, you might end up with another provider creating overbuild. And obviously, one of the challenges with that is that each time there's a Wayleave, a different Wayleave for a different provider and a different legal construct. And obviously, there's an increased cost to build, increased complexity, increased disruption, and this can be one of the challenges at the moment. And obviously, one of the models that has been, you know, put forward and adopted in many places across the globe, and hopefully increasingly in the UK, is the open access model. And from a Zayo perspective, this is very much where we would operate and others would operate, in terms of this infrastructure layer that is a step back from even the wholesale active providers and retail service providers, where we're able to have this joined up infrastructure layer where we're able to, you know, essentially build the infrastructure once and then utilize it a number of times. So we're doing this at the moment where we're providing our backhaul capability to enable alternative network providers to then, you know, build the network layer. And again, I'm sure you've all seen this layer articulated in many different guises. And then you might have wholesale access providers that are operating in the network layer, and then potentially you've got additional layers of retail service providers where consumers are able to consume those services on a wholesale open access basis. So we're often 2 steps behind that, and trying to sort of consolidate that infrastructure to minimize those challenges. And then, of course, if you're in the rural sector, there may not be the ability to have a wholesale competitive market where you might have a provider that's providing the network and service elements of that. Now, obviously, this is just a sort of a model to articulate it. I appreciate that you know, there are many different idiosyncrasies of this. But what we do as an infrastructure provider is look to aggregate a lot of this infrastructure back and then have multiple use cases. So if we can go into an urban area, we're able to work with public sector stakeholders, other stakeholders, and build this plan around building an infrastructure that then can be overlaid and utilized multiple times. And the aim of that is obviously to promote the retail competition within the service layer to consumers, give that consumer choice. That's the ultimate aim of you know, providing this innovation at the service layer. And then, of course, wholesale aggregation within the network layer is a hugely important part of the current INCA work, absolutely essential to stitching all of this together. And then we as an infrastructure provider are looking to coordinate infrastructure build, essentially. If we can coordinate that infrastructure build, if we can standardize on elements such as GIS mapping, if we can potentially use things like duct share, where we've actually, you know, done projects and shared duct with other providers, what that means is we can reduce the cost, we can reduce the overbuild, and then that means we're reducing the need for, you know, the sort of Wayleaves and all of the construction and civils works, you know, at that time. So that's very much the approach we try to take as an infrastructure provider. The overall aim of that is to build it once, minimize Wayleaves, minimize the disruption, and coordinate the civils work. And that's not just with other infrastructure providers, that could be with other utilities providers at the same time, to minimize and make that process much more efficient, minimize all of the wavies and civils. So hopefully that gives a bit of a flavor on our perspective and how we're trying to support, you know, this agenda. So the summary points, you know, for me, is that altnets have an absolutely essential role to play in the 2025 target. I was on a session the other day, and I think it was understood that there's been nearly £1 billion of investment from the independent sector, which is fantastic. That's really where all the innovation is coming from, in terms of, you know, to take Hector's presentation, taking somebody from a megabyte to a gigabit, megabit to a gigabit, which is an absolutely transformational change. And so the altnets and the independent sector has really been the source of this investment, service innovation, consumer choice, and that's really where, you know, that push is going to come to meet those 2025 targets. And also in terms of the wholesale, the active wholesale element, INCA's wholesale aggregation program, absolutely essential to deliver this coordinated provisioning, service provider competition, operational standardization, OSS, etc., service portability and support to stitch all of the various different things together. But I would also say there's a huge role for infrastructure providers to play, because, you know, if we can aggregate multi-use demand and work with stakeholders, work with local authorities, other providers, to reduce the overall cost to build, reduce that disruption. If we can standardize duct maps to utilize ducts that are perhaps already built to reduce the need to build new, and also coordinate those civils works and Wayleaves, you know, that's going to go a long way towards reducing the time span of rolling out these technologies, and also reducing the cost to help accelerate those plans towards the 2025 target. So a number of discussion points, which I'm sure we can pick up on later in the discussion area. So what Wayleaves, you know, how can Wayleaves be standardized as a legal document in terms of a landlord's pack that they need to complete? So I make the comparison towards an energy certificate. You know, if you buy a house, you have a standard energy certificate and standard home buyer pack. that goes with everything. And this might be I'm sure the lawyers are looking at this thinking this might be an oversimplification, but there's millions of different types of Wayleaves, and if this can be standardized and made into a standard pack, this is surely going to be much more effective when we're looking at these type of challenges. And then in planning, what changes can be made to local planning laws? So obviously, Richard and Lisa at DCMS touched on why we have these Wayleaves here and the human rights implications. But if you look at a lot of European countries, which are subject to the same laws, that a lot of them don't even have Wayleaves. So, what do we need to do to reduce the need for Wayleaves, or actually can we get rid of them completely? And as Hector pointed out, there's still obviously obligations and risks and liabilities on the landowners. So where is the happy medium? How can local and central government help coordinate those planning elements? How can telecoms infrastructure providers work with each other and local planners and other local utilities to coordinate civils works? Dig once, have one Wayleave, or certainly minimise the duplications of overbuild and the challenges around having multiple Wayleaves and multiple disruption. And then another question really is around, well, what about standard duct and GIS maps? A big part of what we've been doing at Zayo is standardising on the duct assets that we own. Every day we're discovering, having acquired 46 companies, every day we're discovering, putting into our duct maps new duct that we have, which potentially can reduce the need to build new, reduce the cost and reduce the disruption. And then, a call to action really is on the sort of retail, the alternative network providers, and retail and wholesale service providers. How can you work with infrastructure providers where it's appropriate to overlay use cases to help business models in the region, whether this is duct share, or whether this is overlaying those multiple use cases to have a build once philosophy to make that investment case and that rollout case work more smoothly and more effectively. So I guess the final thoughts from me on this are twofold really. Picking up on some of the speakers earlier on, how can we cooperate? Cooperation is going to be an absolutely essential approach, particularly in the urban areas, in terms of cooperating it together. If there's a finite pot of money, finite amount of government funding, finite consumer spend, and finite infrastructure provider investment, there's a finite pot of money essentially. So the only way we're going to achieve the aims for 2025 and get the most optimum business case and the optimum delivery case is to drive the cost down, coordinate, collaborate, and reduce the multiple Wayleaves and the multiple overbuilds and the multiple complexity and closing of roads, etc. So cooperation is going to be an absolutely huge part of how we go forward. But then if you do that, how do you then ensure competition? So how do infrastructure providers such as ourselves cooperate whilst maintaining that essential competition, which is going to be very important to create that vibrant market where you've got competitive elements to avoid the very monopolies that we're seeking to replace here. So those were some final points from me. Once again, appreciate the opportunity to speak, and really looking forward to the work with other INCA members. There's a huge amount of fantastic work that's been done, not just by INCA, but also INCA members in the independent sector, but a huge amount of work lays ahead. And I look forward to being part of that and having further discussions this afternoon. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stuart. That is very interesting. It obviously has a completely different perspective from the rural environment. I want to go now to Tim Stranack from Community Fibre, who obviously also has, there we are, hands-on, so to speak, perspective on how to deliver construction within London in particular. So, Tim, over to you.
Thanks. So, yes, I think most of you know me, but I'm Tim Stranack. I'm one of the founders at Community Fibre. And for those who don't know us, we're, according to the latest INCA point topic analysis, we're the largest 100% full fibre to the home provider in London. with over 120,000 properties now enabled with full gigabit full fibre connectivity. We signed Wayleaves, because it's the common topic today, Wayleaves with over 50 of London's largest landlords, including 10 of the London boroughs. Interestingly, for those who know London, that still leaves another 23 London boroughs that we're still trying to sign Wayleaves with after probably 3 years of trying. So that sort of gives you a flavour for some of the challenges. I believe we're also now the largest user of Openreach's PIA product in London, and just picking up on the last presentation, we're a customer of Zayo's, so that's the connection there. So obviously in an urban setting, our main issue with regards to Wayleaves is about getting into multi-dwelling units, and so properties that have multiple dwellings within them. And obviously to get through the communal areas in those multi-dwelling units, you need the permission of the landlord, which is a Wayleave. Some of the key objections we seem to get from landlords, often we'll hear, oh, we don't have space in the risers for any more cables. And we'll typically explain how small fibre optic cables are, and they're normally okay with that. Another common sort of retort is, you're not BT or Virgin, how can we trust you? And then we go into, well, do you trust BT or Virgin? And typically the answer is no. And we then explain how we built the business so that they can trust us to do the installation to a very high quality. Which then tends to address their other objection, is you're going to damage our building in some way. And particularly at the moment, certainly in London and other cities, I'm sure, but across the country, fire stopping and maintaining fire integrity is vitally important. And then sometimes we'll get, oh, you're going to create a monopoly by putting this fibre in, rather than thinking, actually, we're increasing competition and increasing consumer choice. So we sometimes have to explain that. But the most common question we get from all these organisations is, are we allowed to do this? As a landlord, are we allowed to give you permission? And if we are allowed to give you permission, oh, I've got to figure out who in my organisation actually needs to provide that permission. Because often the landlords just simply don't know. In theory, they'll have put a Wayleaf in place with BT a number of years ago, or possibly 100 years ago. But I suspect Wayleaves weren't really talked about much then, because the government just went in and installed the telecommunications network. So this is really quite a new thing to a lot of operators, and they simply just don't know what they're meant to do and how they're meant to do it. And so I'm going to pick up on a common theme that I think has come up in every presentation we've had so far. What we as operators need to do with our trade bodies is facilitate a dialogue with the landlords and explain to them what their part is in achieving this full fibre rollout across the country. It was really interesting to hear Charles on earlier. Thank you, Charles, for joining us today. Very keen to engage with your colleagues in some of the other landlord associations, because really promoting that dialogue, as you say, between the landlords and the operators is going to be the quickest and most efficient way through this. I think Charles pointed out the mobile history. The landlords that do know about Wayleaves will typically have been tainted by some of the complications they've experienced in the mobile industry. The fixed line proposition is quite different. It is actually benefiting often the people in the properties that we're enabling, which are different to how the mobile infrastructure worked. But the problem is often the tussle with the mobile operator wanting to put a mast on the roof is the only experience many landlords will have had about Wayleaves, and that can taint their view when we're coming to roll out fibre. We obviously as Community Fibre are running our own marketing campaigns and investing in our own campaigns specifically directed at landlords in London. And I'm pleased to say Matt Warman, the digital minister, is being very supportive with colleagues at DCMS that we heard from earlier, and indeed INCA. We're all together trying to convene, I think, what we're calling a landlord roundtable as a means to just try to start that dialogue and start for us as an industry of operators to understand directly from landlords what are their issues so that we can go away and address those. From our perspective, and we've mentioned a couple of times having a standard Wayleaf so it doesn't have to go through such a tough negotiation. We've tried to support and use the City of London Corporation Wayleaf. It seems to be a reasonable balance between landlords and operators, and we've had some success in using that. But yes, going back to my question earlier to DCMS, probably the ultimate solution is to have a defined Wayleaf agreement in primary legislation. But I understand the complexities in that. You can't quite have the same Wayleaf for a leaseholder and a freeholder, let alone a mobile operator and a fixed line operator. So there are complexities there. And although it'd be lovely to get that primary legislation through, that's going to take time. So really the quickest way, and what I'm encouraging everyone to do, is start that dialogue with landlords, look at it as an industry, how we can start that dialogue with landlords and actually work, I think, going back to Stuart's presentation, work in collaboration with the landlord industry so that we can accelerate this rollout. We're as I said, we're past 125,000 properties now in London. We could do double or triple that if we were able to get the landlords on board and get the Wayleaves fast enough. So that's all I really wanted to say today, and keen to join the panel and answer any questions that people might have.
Tim, thank you very much. So if you have any questions, put them into chat. Malcolm and Rob, you can then, if you can sort of identify good questions that perhaps a few people are picking up, ask those questions, and then I'll try and encourage appropriate panelists to give the answers. So I'll give you a few minutes to look through those and find some questions, because a few interesting things here. So kind of looking at the difference between the rural and the urban, the key difference in the urban almost seemed to be try not to build. Do anything you can to avoid building. If you don't have to build, then you don't have to pay a Wayleave, which, you know, so sort out the Wayleaves. I guess that there's a certain logic to that, which is kind of interesting. Though I do have concerns about what that means in terms of infrastructure competition. Stuart, I think I need to look pointedly at you in terms of that, because you seem to be doing almost a City Fibre level of, yeah, we'll be here, we'll provide competition to Openreach. Everybody else, I think the words were something along the lines of back off, something like that. Sounded like back off at the time. It wasn't from me, that was from City Fibre, of course. So yeah, we need to maintain that. Tim, very disturbing that the idea is that Wayleaves are holding back 2/3 of the properties that you will be covering. That's bad. I mean, if it really is that bad, then we have a problem. Aidan, you have been exercised throughout all of this. Any questions? You're on mute, Aidan. Oh,
yeah, I've just come off. I can just sort of outline experiences and concur with Tim on stuff. One of the things in Hatton Garden, it's an existing, this is for CenturyLink, I'm doing some PIA bits and pieces to migrate, you know, just take a bunch of existing BT tails and migrate them. So this is not quite the same as Tim's business of, you know, pioneering, but it is doing that. Astonishing things. One of the customers got extremely irate with the and also the agent that we couldn't reuse the BT fiber that was already in the riser or the cable and wireless stuff. So again, there was this business about just in general. There are a few companies around in London who actually specialise in building management in order to not drive the landlord crazy. But it's another example of this. The UK is the worst in the world. I got CenturyLink to do a study of this. In the US, if you stopped an operator going into another building, you'd probably go to jail as a landowner, or you'd end up, or as a landlord, or you'd end up in serious trouble. One of the better ones seems to be in Spain, where they seem to have divided up. Construction companies will have entered into block arrangements with blocks of properties, and they will have half a dozen or so. And if you want to get into any one of those, the construction company already has it. On another thing, one of the more inspired landowners, and I won't go into who, we're having a discussion now about flood wiring a business park. And instead of CenturyLink paying for fibre onto the park, the landlord's going to pay for the lot on the grounds that he owns it, but that it's an open access network. So we've got a mini example of an open access thing. But I mean, that's just a few experiences I'm throwing in. But the thing is still an absolute bloody mess. And I agree with Tim. The amount of time, I must spend 3/4 of my time on Wayleaves and not just getting the bloody fibre into a building.
Okay. Malcolm, Rob, any questions that are popping up?
Well, Rob's got a comment, so I think that would be useful to hear.
Is this the one that I did earlier on?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it was a comment in response to Stephen Pegram's point, and he asked a question: to what degree is one of the issues with infrastructure owners confidentiality of routes, etc.? So those fibre providers that are sharing or not sharing details of where their routes are, and I think that is an issue, and various people have different views on this, I think, but most operators want to protect their assets. They don't actually want to share where they are. Present company accepted Stuart from Zayo, who publish it on their website. There is potentially a critical national infrastructure issue here as well, since many national operators share ducts in many areas in kind of a standard figure of 8, I guess. If you know where to cut, you could cause an awful lot of damage. I'm not saying that's the main problem. I think it is one of just protecting their own assets. I don't know if there's any other views on that.
Particularly keen to hear if Lisa or Richard, if you have a view on that issue of transparency over routes. Is that anything that DCMS is thinking about?
So I know that a few parties are looking at developing underground asset registers. I mean, in terms of transparency over buried assets like that, I can't say I'm fully aware of our position on that, but I know that lots of different councils are performing audits of what they have in the ground, and they're trying to get as much data as they can from the likes of OpenReach and Virgin Media and the like. But I probably actually can't give a definitive answer because I'm not actually too sure.
Can I just, I'm just maybe chip into that because I think some of your colleagues, Richard, were looking at what is the access to infrastructure regulations that were brought in a few years ago, which in theory say that any operator can use anyone else's asset that currently sits under the ground, as long as you can negotiate a suitable commercial agreement with that person. I think what's really held up that came in as part of a European directive. I think what's really held up that in this country is you can only really start those commercial negotiations if you know where the assets are, and if you can see you can see that someone's already got a duct under the street that you could potentially use. That lack of visibility does rather impair the sort of usability of those regulations that came in a few years ago.
Yeah, I know a few companies are not just companies. So, for example, the GLA Greater London Authority are doing a programme on this, and I know that a few companies have looked at ways in which they can map out buried assets. I think on the ATI regs, we've been meaning to publish a call to evidence for a while, but obviously with COVID, things have changed somewhat. But that's still very much our intention to take a look at that again. But in terms of the underground assets, I think quite a few companies are doing this.
Hector, any thoughts on that from your perspective?
I mean, I think from our point of view, we try and be as open as we can with as many people as possible. And certainly Rob and what he's doing, we're looking at sharing assets with an initiative that he's running to look at wholesale use of assets. I mean, I think in our area, we have definitely seen evidence of open-reach overbuilding us in areas where we know that we have assets. And we have very good evidence in one particular area of 3 projects, around 150 houses. So relatively small project where the community was categorically not being built, confirmed by the council and by open-reach to the community. We put plans in place. They changed their mind. We said, fine, if you're going to build, then we're not going to overbuild you. They changed their mind again. We then built, and they then changed the superfast contract after we'd finished building to overbuild us. And it was an early one, so they didn't have the ability to area. And that's our biggest worry about sharing infrastructure maps, is that we've got the difference in scale of companies. As a small company, a much larger company could obstructively overbuild us as a rounding error on their deployment costs without having a massive impact on them. But for us, it's very difficult to prove that that's been done. And so that's probably where the worry comes from. But we very much would like to share, open access to our infrastructure and like to be much more open about, people to use it. And at the end of the day, as a smaller operator, or any business, it's potential revenue stream if it can be got right. But I think it's definitely an industry point to discuss. How can we do it properly, and how can we ensure that it doesn't impact other people's, build plans? And I think particularly in rural areas, the hangover of superfast contracts that more funds are being topped up into, where the earlier contract didn't have the appropriate change control mechanisms to control where open-reach went. In our case, it's generally open-reach for the contracts. Mean that overbuild can be quite difficult to stop in some cases if it was planned over. And so that's our biggest concern. But where we can, where we're working with other alternative operators, we're very happy to share our infrastructure. And in rural areas, I think it definitely makes a lot of sense. And the cost of building in rural areas means we're unlikely to have in the long run, overbuild or multiple operators at a physical infrastructure layer. So that sharing will need to happen at some point. It's just how we get there.
Yeah, agreed. And just to say that you're not alone, Hector, in terms of this overbuild issue. There's a number of other, certainly INCA members and other altnets that have expressed similar concerns. I'm just conscious, James, there's a bunch of questions on Wayleaves, which is kind of the purpose of the meeting.
Absolutely. Read them out.
So probably, there were a few Q&As that we said we'd ask or answer later, and later is now. So shall I, unless they've already been answered somehow, but I'll take the first one, which is Tim Creswick at 2:30. As a broader question, what's the rationale for treating large providers and small providers differently? Aren't we at risk of endorsing BT's monopoly position by having a bifurcated process? To what extent should we insist that smaller providers should be able to access equivalent agreements regardless of whether it's PIA? And I'm not sure to what that was referring to, or to which presentation it was referring to.
I think that goes right back to Charles's presentation, actually. That's certainly where I was most aware of it. However, slightly controversially, I'm not going to go to Charles straight away for the answer on that one. Tim, any views on that?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons the associations such as Charles might want to talk to more newer operators first, or differently, as opposed to maybe BT or Virgin, is we actually can be quite creative and innovative and flexible in working with landlords and coming to some sort of reasonable agreement. Whereas often, definitely the mobile operators and potentially BT and Virgin don't seem to have or don't seem to want to have that flexibility.
Hector, any view?
Yeah, I think I definitely echo that, and I think particularly where the smaller operators have an intention to be seen to be having good engagement with people and not wishing to ruin the reputation that they have, because that's a very important part of uptake. I think certainly the smaller operators are much much keener to come to a reasonable agreement, and we certainly wouldn't want to be seen to be going down the route of that the mobile operators have done in this area.
Okay, Charles.
As I said during the presentation, if you go back to the history of this, obviously Openreach are the biggest infrastructure providers. It was important that we had an agreement with them to begin with. We were then approached in 2010, I think it was, by GigaClear to get an agreement with them, and we managed to pull in a couple of other or number of other alternative network providers. As I said in the presentation, I think there needs to be a separate agreement or a separate element to the framework which includes smaller alternative network providers. In order to be able to do that, we need to start discussing it. We need to work out what the basis of that agreement will be. And as Hector was alluding to earlier, we need to do it sooner rather than later. And as I've said before, I'm more than happy to begin discussions, begin talks. But obviously, it's from a practical point of view, you've got the NFU that I've got to bring on side as well, which shouldn't be that difficult. But I also need to talk to a representative body of the smaller alternative network providers. If that's INCA, fine, don't have a problem. But if you want to start the process, more than happy to actually begin the negotiations and begin discussions.
Okay, I guess that's the route that we're going to go down at some point. Lisa, I'm very keen to get your view on this, because I have to admit, I have a strong opinion on this, which I know it's probably against the rules, but I'm going to give it soon. But Lisa, over to you.
Can I hear your opinion first?
Okay. I think it almost comes along what Carolyn Johnson would call the stupid laddie question, or stupid laddie want. One sort of backstop Wayleave agreement that everyone can use almost without no, there's a spare almost in there, without negotiation, so that providers can say, yes, we can deliver, we can get this done, and here is a Wayleave. However, as we go to some areas, such as Hector would say, that are just not viable, commercially viable on that, then have modifications for that have been agreed. And so that backstop Wayleave doesn't stop you negotiating better, more appropriate Wayleaves for areas that are not so commercially viable. And then perhaps make those publicly available. Now, obviously, commercial agreements, a lot of people get quite sensitive about letting other people know what their commercial agreements are. But I think we need to go beyond that to say, look, here's one that we have found can be agreed. And so people get this sort of weight of, yes, they're not, there's one default that you can always rely on. And then here are things that other people have found to be appropriate. And maybe they're a good starting point as well.
Can I add to that as well? One of the other questions from Georgina Rudak is about struggling to get engagement from some freeholders where there's no tenant in place, and seeking a Wayleave to facilitate the network build. They get to an impasse where tenants can't order services because the operator's not present, the operator can't be there because the Wayleave isn't there, etc., etc.
And having that default Wayleave will get that's one of the reasons for having that. You say, basically, here is a Wayleave. You can come and sign it, and later if you like.
I mean, I think I think with that. I think that in the case of the smaller operators, or in case of what we're talking about, or Charles is talking about there, the understanding has to be that it can't be one agreement, because there are different bits of infrastructure. If you want to go and put a stocking great duct, which is dug with a trench and is going to be 6 inches below the ground, that's much more than important to landowners than something that's a metre deep as a buried cable. And so there is some understanding the way that work. It might be that, you know, we definitely do want to have standard agreements as far as possible, but the way that Openreach works and the way that a smaller operator works, and particularly for someone like ourselves, where we're happy to give lift and shift and damage waivers, that's a material chunk of the liability to the landowners gone. And so that may well see some different flavors, but I agree. I think the most important thing is a standardization on the process for going through a Wayleaves, and the standardization, ensuring that landowners come to the table and start the negotiation or have the negotiations. And then if we can get consensus and standardization on the price, that's fantastic. And if we can get that across the whole industry, even better. But it's a difficult thing to do.
Lisa,
yeah. Okay, so I think just to pick up on a couple of points in terms of the different standards that you might need for the large scale operators and the smaller altnets. I think Charles's suggestion is an excellent one, that you start that dialogue, and DCMS will be happy to do anything we can to support and facilitate that. Because I think that's the thing is, even if government was to look at introducing something standardised, that would be further down the line than you need it to be. And it is obviously much better if you can negotiate it on an industry to site provider basis than something that's imposed at the end of a huge consultation period, a huge legislative process, etc., etc. Then the other thing that was just mentioned there, just to recap on the point I think Hector said about pricing.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
Yeah, I got totally sidelined. There were too many things in that whole dialogue that I was too interested in, so I got a little bit sidelined. Yeah, and sort of the idea of standardised Wayleave where you just have it and you get agreement later. I think what's important to remember is that our current legislative framework evolved in a very particular way, and evolved in a way that meant site providers built up over time certain expectations regarding how and what their land could be used for. And while we absolutely recognise digital communications as a utility, we need to think very carefully about how that's managed. When we talked earlier, or when Richard mentioned earlier that we'd be looking at the impact of the 2017 reforms, what we're really looking at is, what does that legislative framework now look like, and does it deliver what we need it to deliver? So a lot of these things are questions that we are going to ask about. Should there be greater levels of compulsion? Should there be greater control of the pricing? Has the valuation regime that we introduced delivered what we expected it to deliver? And where you've talked about processes in terms of engagement, certainly we would be looking at, do we need to do more there to make negotiation happen quickly and constructively? So that'll be part of our legislative review. But in addition to that, there'll be the landlord meeting that I think was mentioned earlier that Matt Warman's going to host. And that's all part of an ongoing package of stakeholder engagement and negotiation that we're planning to have over the autumn, to see, well, what are the immediate interventions that might be possible to get things progressing a little more smoothly and quickly for everyone.
Okay, Rob, Malcolm, have we got any more?
Have we
got any more questions, Rob or Malcolm?
Oh, there's one from Caitlin Johnston, which I thought was interesting. Is her points the point she's making is that the industry needs to be more resilient in relation to the code. Code operators have the protection of the code, so the process can be followed in scenarios where landlords are demanding ransom or refusing access, etc. Most of the operators I've spoken to about using the code are pretty reluctant to actually, force their way onto property using the code. I don't know if anybody's got any views on that on the panel.
We probably shouldn't be telling Charles that, because we won't have much of a negotiation with him if he doesn't think there's a possibility we might use the code to force the negotiation. I get to the right kind of conclusion. I can see it being attractive to do these things directly, especially given that we've got the CLA being very cooperative and engaging. So I think if we can take that route and come to a sensible negotiation, it's much better for landowners. The CLA have got a much better position to get landowner buy-in, and not to end up with a situation where there is real enmity towards the mobile operators in rural areas. And I think the case with mobile is definitely far more of an impingement on landowners' rights than fibre. So the fact that they've got it through means that it should be possible. If you look at the fact that for a mobile phone tower, they take your land, you have no access to it, they lock you out, and they put a tower on it, and you have to deal with the visibility of that, and regular comings and goings for power and everything else, and ensuring maintenance. Once the fibre's in the ground, it's gone. So I think the code is definitely there and something that could be used, but I think it would be if we as an industry can come to a sensible consensus that works for everyone without it, I think that's fantastic.
What about you, Tim? What do you think?
Yeah, I'd pick up on Hector's point earlier about we've always taken the stance since we started that this is about working in collaboration with landlords. There is always the fear from the operator that if you're the one that goes first and uses the code and successfully uses the code, you will then paint your reputation as an aggressive operator and no other landlord will then talk to you. And so there is that risk. However, there are some landlords that we have been trying to engage for a number of years now in London, and we are now getting to the point, and I hope DCMS and GLA will support us if we do take this line, that we are now thinking about starting some potentially tribunal proceedings against them.
So if I can interrupt there, and please stop me if I can't. Government's position on this has always been absolutely clear. The idea of the litigation measures in the code was that where you can't reach consensual agreement, there is a route available for disputes to be settled. And we brought the code out of the county courts and into the tribunal because we wanted that to be able to be a realistic option for industry where they needed it. So completely understand what you're saying about the need for good relationships between site providers and operators. And our position was always, yes, those working relationships are and will continue to be really important. And we would always like to see a consensual agreement reached in the first instance where that's possible. But where it isn't, or whereas we're in the position with it to some extent at the moment, there are hugely different views on how certain aspects of the code should be interpreted. We absolutely recognise that tribunals are going to be the only way those things can be resolved. And hopefully the more that we get key cases like we've had recently, the more that will help the market to settle and inform negotiations.
Yeah, it seems a shame that some of the landlords that have had key rulings against them still are not granting Wayleaves. I think
where
some London authorities came up earlier.
Yeah, local authorities.
Yeah, and I think certainly, Tim, as Rich mentioned earlier, where it's public sector organisations that are involved, we do want those things bringing to our attention, and we will try and help and support you where we can.
What about the question that asked by Sharon about the costs that the lawyers charge for picking up I was going to say picking up a pen, but I guess they do actually start to use computers nowadays. 1,500 quid for one Wayleave. I mean, again, surely some degree of standardisation, difficult though that might be, would actually help to reduce some of those costs because.
Yeah,
that's a
I think I saw this earlier on the conversation thread, and it is something we're very interested in. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors guidance that was published earlier this year about conduct in negotiations did make some references to fees, but obviously that's in the surveying space rather than the legal space. But I think it's fair to say that moving forwards, this is something we'll be picking up with the Law Society as well, just to take a steer from them and to try and get some market evidence, etc. And yes, it is very much something that, as part of our evaluation this autumn, we will be looking at to what extent is that having a difficult effect on deals being reached. You know, we hear a lot of the anecdotal information, as I'm sure all of you do, and it is an area of concern for us and something that we're going to look into.
Well, I think it's the case that you can't have a situation that we've had where you've got 4 separate Wayleave agreements and you've got one lawyer, one solicitor, and 4 separate legal fees. When you actually, all you need to do is just bring the lots together. And we understand that that can be a major problem. In terms of going back onto whether the operators or the infrastructure providers use the code to force through things, it's always far better to do this by consensus and by compromise and agreement. Otherwise, you're just going to slow the whole process down. We've had major problems because of this in the mobile sector. What you don't want to do is replicate what's happening in mobile with a fixed line sector, because if you do, your chances of meeting the 2025 deadline, or whenever it is, will never be reached because landowners would simply not cooperate.
Yeah, but then that's cutting off their noses to spite their own faces, because this is about.
Believe me, they will do that.
Yeah, no, I would second that. It will be.
And I've spoken to people who are more than willing to do that. That's the problem I've got, because what I'm trying to do is educate the providers. I understand how landowners think, but also the landowners to understand how the law works, and get the compromise together and bring everybody together in one space so that we can actually make progress.
Great.
Just to add, it's probably worth mentioning Aidan's comment on this. He's left the call now, but he's they're ridiculous, and Aidan probably has quite a lot of experience in this area. In his experience, he said he's not ended up with anything more than 4 different variations, but solicitors' costs tend to be applied to each different one. What he did say was it makes a huge difference to have a document with a government crest on it. Certainly shortcuts all of the issues, and I guess reduces costs. Probably just worth mentioning.
Yeah, that's a good point.
One thing that I wondered, Charles, when you were saying about having different agreements for different size of operator, would perhaps another approach be different agreements for different environments? We're used to the idea of Area 1, Area 2, Area 3, and if they were a more appropriate starting point for how to have differences in the Wayleaves, then would that work?
That's an interesting point, because Area 3 is anticipated to only have 1 operator, whereas the Area 2 is going to be more competitive.
Exactly, and it's that difference between infrastructure competition that underpins those differences. Sorry, I said Charles first for that one though. So, go on, Charles. Any thoughts?
Let's just try. There we go. If you bring it to the table, we'd be more than happy to explore it. As I said before, you bring anything to the table, we're more than happy to discuss it. What we want to see is a resolution to the problems and the issues that keep arising, because they're not doing our members any benefit, and they're certainly not actually meeting the needs of both yourselves as the providers and also the needs of government. And we've said publicly that we fully support and fully behind what the government is trying to do. But in order to be able to do that, there's got to be an element of compromise and give on both sides. Because if we take the example that we see, that landowners see an infrastructure provider trying to get one over on them, they're simply not going to. It's not going to work. And as an organisation, as a membership trade association, obviously we'd have to support our members.
All right, I'm going to take that next to Hector as almost for an Area 3 perspective, and then to Stuart for an Area 1 and 2 perspective.
I think the really key point here is that if you look at the 2017 code, it very clearly states that market value, which the Wayleave should be agreed under, may not take into account the value of land to the telecommunications operator. The guiding principle is that the rate based on the value to the landowner. And so why does the value to the landowner change in place A versus place C, unless we're doing it on the value of the land rather than the value to the operator? And I think that's the interesting point if you're really looking at undertaking an agreement which looks at the code and is according to the code. And I think that's why I would say that's a dangerous area to start steering down. But I do definitely echo what Charles was saying before around landowners and the ability of landowners to as someone else put it, cut off their nose to spite their face. It is a position that, I think that the longevity of ownership of land in this country is something that gives people a very, very different perspective. And when you say that a lot of the landowners that you'll be working with here will have owned their land from 1600, 1700, 1800, as far as they're concerned, it is their absolute right incarnate primogeniture that they own that piece of land. And so it is a sensitive negotiation, and I think attitude is very important, and the way that telecoms approach landowners is very important. And that's why I think that the mobile operators, although they have achieved their objective and they've probably reduced the average mobile telephone mast annual cost from between 6,000 between 500 and £1,000, I think they will have spited the industry in the long term, because they're going to find it very, very difficult to roll out 5G services in rural areas where it's a materially different product, because everyone is going to fight like anything to get rid of that. And the first case that went through court around, I think, American states, proves that and proves what the feeling is against that.
There's a couple of other comments.
A quick comment from Stuart before we move on.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think, standardization is a huge part of it, because, there's two things here. One is obviously standardizing as much as possible on the legal construct and as much as standardization allows, but then leaving some element of that, the 20% of the document that needs to be specific to each individual case. I mean, we have Wayleaves in the thousands at Zayo, and every time they're negotiated differently. So the more that can be standardized, the better. And I also think there's an element around, making it part of a landlord pack. Previous projects that have been involved is you come up around challenges into who should the Wayleave be with. You might actually have a building operating company or a landlord company, and then it's actually the land is owned by somebody else. So it can be a very complex process. So the more that can be streamlined so that document is ready to go and standardized, the better.
In fact, Tim Kresick has suggested that it would be quite a huge time saver if they could direct landlords to a government website where they can learn about the process, register their property, etc. Although that's a bit strange, but record the existence of a Wayleave agreement between the operator and them is sort of an interesting idea, and that could be something worth thinking about.
That website is called the Digital Connectivity Portal.
Great, thanks, Richard.
That saves time. Excellent. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, to solve the problem with the solicitors by Dean Checkley saying the fees issue could be addressed with the Solicitors Regulation Authority, as they have a drive to enable transparency of fees for all. So maybe they would be worth talking to. I don't know, no idea, but that sounds interesting.
Are there any other questions, Malcolm and Rob? Sorry,
can I just come back on to what Malcolm just said about the lawyers? If you look back to the as to why RICS issued guidance, which it did in November last year, was because of the reputational impact that the agents were having in terms of their negotiations with providers, in the sense that they were not actually acting in an ethical manner. Now, if it's the case that the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, or whatever it is, can actually say to solicitors, you have to work according to your own code of ethics, which all these institutions have, then that would be one way forward. Now, I think the RICS guidance is actually quite helpful on that point, because it basically said agents have to apply to common standards. If they're not doing that, they're breaking their own code of ethics, and they can be kicked out of RICS. And if you're not a member of RICS, you can't practice.
That's interesting. So basically what you're saying is if the SRA were given, on a plate, actually what it should look like, and, had a discussion about how it could work, etc., then it might actually help to ensure that the fees weren't too exorbitant.
Because I think, even from my point of view and who I represent, I think solicitors' fees are exorbitant, and they don't need to be anywhere near as high as they are for the actual volume of work that they conduct. This is not rocket science.
I mean, Sharon McDermott made a point on the chat as well, agreeing with Charles. One client they had were being charged over £7,000 for a Wayleave for 4 flats. And, the tenants wanted a connection for 20 quid a month each. It just doesn't stack up, does it? £7 grand Wayleave, it's going to consume all of the income for years to come.
Lisa, sorry, did you have any comments on that? I had to mute you at one point because there was some feedback from your line when Charles was talking. Okay, you were looking like you wanted to contribute.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem.
I think I've been like nodding and agreeing away. Yeah, I think somebody mentioned the point about the guidance and what that does in reference to fees, well, that we're looking at whether it's possible to create in the legal space. And I think somebody also asked about websites and government endorsed products. Richard mentioned the digital connectivity portal, that already has a lot of information on for local authorities and for operators as well. And I think certainly moving forwards, we'll be looking at the information that's on that website and that's on the Ofcom site, because from our perspective, there's a big question around how much can we provide accessible, easy information to the public that makes them more confident about having these discussions without necessarily feeling that like they need to hand it out, so that at least they go in with this background understanding, and that when they are engaging somebody to act on their behalf, they understand what it is that that person will be doing for them, and they're in a better position to talk about fees.
We have got a comment here from Sharon McDermott saying that Trench's Law's fees aren't exorbitant. And as an evil consultant, I would say that consultants have a right to earn a living, and so even do lawyers from time to time have the right to earn a living.
If I could just add,
and I think
you've muted yourself.
Go on, Lisa. Go on, Lisa.
Yeah, I think absolutely agree with that comment. I think the point is one of transparency and of making sure that both parties on both sides understand what they're being charged for and what is involved, and that it's reasonable.
I think just a wider point I was going to make earlier, and not just limited to code and Wayleaves, is along the point we mentioned earlier about collaboration, which I completely agree is probably one of the most important things. But it's absolutely key that all parties know what their representatives are doing as well. So, for example, I intervened on behalf of an INCA member a few weeks ago on the highway side of things, where the information I had was that the Highways Authority simply wasn't playing ball. But in actual fact, what the exact issue was that the contractor was miscommunicating to the operator client. So collaboration definitely is key, but all parties, operators and highways authorities, need to be aware of how their representatives are behaving. And obviously in the code, that's more relevant than any other part of the deployment process.
Okay, yes, certainly. Malcolm, Rob, any other questions?
It's a bit of a spat about whether the SRA is actually useful in this process between Dean and David, but I think
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave the call reasonably soon because I've got another meeting to get to. But
I don't think there are any more. I can't see any more questions unless if anyone has stated a question and not had it asked out, then please restate it. We may have missed it in all the background chat.
I think there's a couple of questions that were asked to me. If I might take a couple of seconds just to answer them. So the first question was around DC Zayo working in conjunction with other open access networks such as OpenReach City Fibre. So yes is the answer to that. So we do have duct chairs with other providers, and I think what's important, to Richard's point, is being absolutely very clear of where there is collaboration, where there is competition. So in certain scenarios where there is an open access network or a project being built in the city, we will absolutely be competitors with City Fibre. But if there is a scenario, and there are scenarios which I won't share today, where, for example, we have got existing duct in the ground, which is not being commercialized at the moment, and certain providers are building in that area, it makes sense to be smart and work together. So I think it's just, so yes is the answer to that, where it's appropriate. And the other question I had was around infrastructure owners' confidentiality. Yeah, big issue. Zayo's approach is to publish it on the website. You can discuss amongst yourselves, you know, what the pros and cons of that are. But I think that's certainly one way. And protection of assets. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one, because one of the things that's been a learning curve for me is actually in certain areas of government, if you go to a chief executive of a council and talk about global connectivity, absolutely love that. But if you go to a central government agency, they'll say, well, hang on a minute, you know, we want UK sovereign. So now you're talking about, well, we want to know where everything is, and is it UK sovereign, etc. So I think it's really, again, just, you know, making sure that there's the appropriate dialogue and the appropriate safeguards around, you know, sharing that information in the best forum.
Okay. Any final comments or heckles from the panelists then?
From the panelists, heckles from the panelists, or heckles from the audience to the panelists?
Oh, I was thinking heckles from the panelists. They're always much more fun because we can get to see their expressions.
I've just got one heckle from the panelists, which is obviously, you know, again, appreciative of Helen and Titan for sponsoring today. I did mention in their video about Bavaria being the centre of Europe, but they have actually got a big place in Northampton where I am, and so they might just want to tweak that. Yes. Northampton being the centre of culture in Europe as an alternative.
I think you'll find that Rob will tell you that the centre of the university is actually Milton Keynes, so
which is very close to Northampton, actually, but yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, one thing talking about expressions, I meant to say right at the beginning of this, if anyone thinks that I've been squinting in either disbelief or disapproval throughout this, then it's not that. I just managed to get some kind of eye infection over the weekend, and today is the first day for some time that I've actually been able to see. So it's apologies if I've looked, if people have thought I've been opposed to anything anyone's been saying. It's just that I'm having problems with my eyes. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah.
Apologies. Somehow, the start was a bit awkward. Didn't work very well, but I think we warmed up to the end. But maybe that's the case for some of our live events as well. So never mind. Thank you very much.
Experience. Yeah. Thanks to everybody.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Cheers.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers all. Thank you.